So let me just say a few words to introduce the seminar, which is our last seminar for this academic year. So we have online the three co-authors, André, Gröger, Gianmarco, León-Ciliotta, and Stillman, with Steven who's gonna make the presentation. So Steven, you have greatly contributed already to the literature on migration and development. Everyone is familiar with your papers on the famous New Zealand lottery for Tongans. So we are really looking forward to listen to your new paper with André and Gianmarco, and thanks for being online with us today.
Thanks so much, Simone. Yeah, no, thanks. So it's a bit of a privilege, I guess, to be the last speaker of the year. It was actually because I canceled once. So I guess I got the last slot almost by choice, I guess, in the end. So yeah, this is co-author work with André and Gianmarco. It's extremely preliminary. I guess it has actually been presented. This is my first time presenting, but it's, and there's even new results. They're just, well, a little bit more than 12 hours old, I think, some of the new results that I'm presenting. So yeah, this is work in progress. It has kind of two components to it, which I'll kind of describe as I go through. But basically, I'm going to talk, the focus of the talk is going to be talking about the impact that Venezuelans have had on a variety of outcomes for Peruvians. So particularly on labor markets, but also on a bunch of other kind of on crime, and also on perceived, a bunch of perceptions about people's lives. And then there's going to be a second part, a little bit on discrimination. I may not, the paper started as a paper more on discrimination, and it's become more interesting in the other direction. So we'll see how much time I have on the discrimination angle on the end, but I'll talk a little bit about it. Okay, so just a little bit of background. I guess for this audience, it's probably only lightly needed. So I mean, as most people probably know, Venezuela has kind of been experience an extremely large crisis now for, I mean, things haven't been great for a while, but since 2016 is kind of when things really picked up being worse. You know, this is a crisis that's kind of a combination of economic mismanagement and political, I don't know if instability is the right word, political stability, maybe in the wrong direction. So, I mean, political aggressiveness combined with sort of economic mismanagement. Yeah, for people who are interested in Venezuela, I mean, the economy is actually getting much better at the moment because there's been a huge liberalization. But most of all the other underlying problems you have from a political dictatorship still exist. I mean, the biggest thing you can see about how bad kind of things have been in Venezuela is by how many people have left. So, I mean, over 5 million people have left Venezuela since 2016. So it's almost 17% of the population. So can you imagine like 20% of I mean, everyone in the US really disliked Trump, but you imagine 20% of the population getting up and leaving because of how bad things are. So, I mean, that's the situation in Venezuela. People have gone kind of everywhere. So, I mean, I'll show you on the next, kind of on the next slide. I mean, I think this is a very important for the context of understanding of, we're going to be looking at Peru. And it's important for understanding that, I mean, when Venezuelans leave Venezuela, there's sort of a hierarchy of places. I mean, you would think the US is kind of at the top of the hierarchy, and then Spain, and then the hierarchy kind of goes through different places in Latin America. And you can see if you look at the data. So, I mean, for example, the skill composition of migrants that go to Colombia, which is kind of the bottom of the hierarchy, is much different than go to Peru, where we're going to be looking at. We don't know so much. I think when we started the idea, we were somewhat original. Now there are a bunch of papers. I'll talk a little bit about the literature, mostly looking at Colombia, but there's also been some work on other countries, including on Peru now. Understanding the effect that this exodus has had kind of on locals. I think we know even less about the impact it's had on Venezuelans themselves. The data is much more difficult in this area. I have a PhD student who's trying to do some work in this area. And one of the bigger picture topics, which kind of got my interest in it, was not as much about the impact on labor markets, which I will talk a little bit more about today, but kind of thinking about, you know, how this experience, the kind of fears of both kind of economic and political backlash. So, I mean, at the beginning of the crisis, I would say, I mean, the general feeling was that Venezuelans were very welcomed into most other countries in Latin America, even into Spain, I would say. Probably because of a long history. You know, Venezuela has a long history as kind of being the richest country, or one of the richest countries in South America. And for example, many Spanish people went there in the 50s and 60s for work. And many Colombians went to Venezuela during the times of political instability in Colombia. So, I mean, Venezuelans were sort of taken in quite openly, I would say. But that probably has changed, so, it was okay when it was small numbers. So here's to give you an idea of the scale. The dark areas are the ones getting the most Venezuelans. So you have 1.7 million Venezuelans in Colombia, and Peru is second. So there's almost 1 million Venezuelans in Peru, 470,000 in Chile. And you can see, actually, I think it would be super interesting, but there the data is very difficult. I wanted to try and find data on Trinidad and Tobago. They're Venezuelans. It doesn't look like a big number. It's only 24,000 people, but Trinidad, I think, has 200,000 people in total. So it's like 10% increase in population from Venezuelans in Trinidad since the crisis. And like I said, there's definitely a hierarchy. So, if you look at the education levels of Venezuela.
Steve, a quick question. So how would these numbers be for US and Spain?
It's true. I think Spain is about 200,000 now, if I remember correctly. 2 to 250, maybe it's up closer to 3 now. I would say the numbers, things slowed down a lot during COVID. So things seem to be picking up a little bit again. So obviously there's been sort of a 6-month to a year break. Spain had about 250,000. Venezuelans now are the second largest group after Moroccans in Spain, which is, third largest, sorry, after Colombians also. And I forgot the numbers for the US. I would think the US might be of that scale also, maybe like 100,000-ish. I have my PhD students looking at the US, because you can see Venezuelans in the IPUMS data. Potentially the US might be the easiest country actually to look at Venezuelans in a lot of ways. I have it coming on a couple of slides later, but one thing that you'll really see in Peru is that in Peru, Venezuelans are the Venezuelans going to Peru have quite high levels of education, where you would see that less in Colombia. So, and you would see that also in Spain and the US. The kind of highest skilled, the US has got actually the most positive selection along education. But the further you get away from Venezuela, so also if I don't have data on it, but if you look at Chile, you also would see that the most migrants to Chile would be higher skilled. So the further you're getting away from Venezuela, the more higher skilled migration you're getting compared to, say, Colombia and Guyana. I haven't seen the data for Brazil, but I'm guessing Brazil also is probably lower skilled too, mostly. So what do we do in this paper? Like I said, this paper kind of, it's got a little bit of too much stuff. If I talked about the history of the paper, you would understand where it comes from. But so I'm going to focus mostly on the first part today, which is thinking about the impact of Venezuelan immigration based on the host country. So I'm going to focus first on labor markets, but then also talk about crime, and also talk about perceptions about crime, perceptions about labor market, and also perceptions about the kind of the immigrants themselves. So I think it's a very interesting, I'll tell you a bit about the data we're using, which allows us to kind of look into some depth into, I would say that's one of our main contributions, is that we're going to look at both kind of objective and subjective outcomes for Peruvians. So basically what we're going to do here is we're going to have repeated cross-sectional data for Peruvians, which is going to, so I'm going to have kind of two identification strategies. The first is sort of a two-way fixed effects identification strategy. So we're going to look at Venezuelans arriving in different municipalities over time and look at how outcomes change for Peruvians. We have especially for our main outcomes, we have a pretty long time series. So I can control for kind of time trends at the municipality level, of which there's over 1,000 municipalities. So that's a real advantage of this. I'm also going to have an IV strategy using, we can have a very in-depth discussion about whether we think it's a good IV, a bad IV, but basically looking at the location of Venezuelans, but in 2007. So 10 years before the crisis started. I was very surprised that this worked, honestly, because there were not very many Venezuelans in Peru. So if you look at the 2007 census, you're talking a few thousand Venezuelans that were in Peru. And still, it seems to be correlated, have a good first stage with where Venezuelans go now in Peru, which doesn't just include Lima, for example. I'll show you the IV estimates. In general, they're very similar to the OLS, which, for gives you some confidence that either the sort of OLS, the two-way fixed effects approach, is a good identification strategy, and or the IV isn't too bad. So that's going to be the main analysis. I go into a bit more detail. The second part, which is actually where the paper kind of started, was thinking more about Venezuelan outcomes, and basically how does the choice of where to settle affect outcomes for Venezuelans. We've looked at labor market outcomes. You don't actually see very much. I'm not going to show you that at all today. The second part we looked at was kind of perceptions around discrimination. So this isn't discrimination per se. This is Venezuelans are asked whether they're discriminated against. We're going to use this. There's a very nice data set that was collected in Peru in December 2018, specialized on the experience of Venezuelans. So lots of data about their migration experience to Peru, what their settlement is like, and what their experiences are like. And that's where we're going to get this measure of kind of perceived discrimination. And I'm going to kind of talk about how does local labor market quality kind of impact perceived discrimination. This is a cross-sectional analysis, so we're going to have an IV, but it has a bit more issues, I would say. But we'll have some time to talk about it. Okay, so just a little more detail on Peru. So Peru experienced the inflow of about a million migrants in total now, probably about 800,000 up to the time period we're going to stop looking at, which is like 2018, 2019 for some of our stuff, early 2019. So it's an increase of about 2.5% of the population. So it's a pretty large shock. I mean, this is pretty, Venezuelans, I mean, the situation with Venezuelans, especially in South America, but also in Spain too, is quite, I mean, I got very interested in it partially for personal reasons, also partially because I think they're just a very interesting migration group. Because typically when we're looking at, you can think of these as it's sort of on the border between forced migration, refugee migration, but it's a group that's really similar to the people in the countries that they're going to, right? So you don't get that. You get that a little bit with, say, Syrian migrants to Turkey. I mean, they're not going to be too different, but clearly, for many refugee migrant groups kind of end up in places where they are not so similar to the groups of the culturally similar to the place that they're going. And also in this case, it's very unusual is that they're also both younger, which is probably not so unusual, but also more skilled than the place that they're going. So in Colombia, I think you would be more similarly skilled. I'll show you I think the data is in one more slide. You'll see, I mean, the Venezuelans in Peru are way more educated than Peruvians. And before they left Venezuela, they would have had way more skilled jobs in general. The other thing that's nice about Peru, but actually it's kind of true for all of South America for Venezuelans, is that up until there's been some changes since the 2019, but in the period we're looking at, Peruvian government basically sort of helped expedite the immigration to Venezuela. So for example, they got rid of the restriction that you needed a passport to enter, and they set up a special residency permit. It has this great name for people who speak Spanish, so Permiso Temporal de Permanencia. So it's a temporary permanent. So, which of course, Gianmarco and I were making fun of it, and André also. I mean, it kind of makes no sense. So it's a permanent temporary permit, but it gives them full rights. So they're allowed to work. Their kids can go to school. They can access the healthcare system. They're basically treated exactly like Peruvians. They can have formal jobs. So this is a group where you, in many ways, could think of them doing very well. If you see them settled in Peru, the data I have on this comes from December 2018. There will be a more recent survey, I guess, that has been in the field in 2020. They're mostly working in low-skilled jobs. So, I mean, there are specific industries that are very common. For example, street vendors, super, super common. Cooks, delivery drivers, cleaners, construction. The typical kind of jobs that you get into when you don't have access to networks, where you don't have access to real jobs. You'll see there are some Venezuelans in formal jobs, but there are not very many. I think the data's on the next slide. And then the other thing that's kind of happened has been kind of an increase. I mean, you can see it in the kind of more in the news media in Peru, an increase in negative attitudes towards Venezuelans over time. You can kind of see, so on the bottom right, this is a survey data from this kind of America's Quarterly, which is one of these, magazines that writes about situations in the Americas. So you can see this is showing basically, I'm afraid of Venezuelans who are arriving in Peru. In 2018, a quarter of Peruvians answered yes to this, up to 52% in 2019. This is from a rally on the left, and for people who can say, close the frontier, don't allow delinquent Venezuelans to enter. So, I mean, and there's been really a big part of the kind of media perception in Peru is that Venezuelans are criminals, that they're bringing crime. Very interestingly, I mean, we were interested in trying to look at a political side of things. As people might know, there's a very nice paper on Colombia looking at kind of political response to this. There actually hasn't been much in Peru. Politicians have not sort of gone down this kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Venezuelan kind of side. As people might know, I mean, there's a huge political crisis in Peru at the moment. So whether that kind of, Gianmarco says that it has a lot to do probably just with internal Peruvian politics, that Venezuelans haven't kind of been targeted in any sense by politicians. But definitely on the street, people have increased negative attitudes towards Venezuelans. Okay, just really briefly, since we're in a pretty short talk. So like I said,
Steve, one question. before you go to the literature, can you say a little bit about the labor market situation in Peru? So if all the immigrants are coming in, so how is it? Do they have a high unemployment rate? Is there shortages in the job market?
I'll show you. I have descriptive statistics on the next slide that will help you answer that. But in general, the labor market was doing pretty well during this time period. So the Peruvian labor market had mostly been expanding and had been doing pretty well. So you should think of it, Gianmarco can correct me, but I think you could think of it as at least up until COVID, right? So I think will be very interesting. Yes. The one very nice thing is that the Peruvian survey data that we're mainly using, it's released quite fast. So we already have for the first half of 2019. So I think, or actually all of 2019. So I think the 2020 data might not be too far away. And then it will be very interesting to look to see how things, Peru has been hit very badly by COVID and also had very long periods of lockdown. So things could have changed a little bit on this side. But you'll see, Sebastian, hold it a little bit to just the next slide, because I'll also show you a little bit about the kind of the economic situation, a little context on that. I don't want to talk about this slide anyway. The main thing to say is that people are working on this topic. The labor market stuff has all been pretty, I would say, most of the findings on the labor market are mixed to nothing, I would say. So there's most of the papers on Colombia have found really no labor market impacts. There's one exception. I think it's the paper by, I forgot which one it is. I think it's the Delgado Prieto paper that finds some negative impacts on low-skilled Colombians. But most of the papers don't find much on labor markets. There's been more findings of impacts on popular opinion and discrimination. So Sandra Rosso has a couple of papers looking at Colombia with Catruk and Vargas. They're finding kind of political response to immigration. So increases discrimination and also increasing politicians kind of with both public and politicians with anti-Venezuelan political platforms and sentiment. So I would say that the labor market literature hasn't found too much, but I think there the context, and probably also like Sebastian's question is part of the context, I think the context really matters. So I mean, in the case of Colombia, the context is very complicated. Many Venezuelans are in the border region, where a lot of people are day commuting back and forth across the border. And also a lot of the economy is very specific to the kind of the border region, aka there's a lot of smuggling and things like this. And like we're talking about in Peru, you have a particularly high skilled group of migrants who are working in areas way below their skill levels and in a labor market that's performing pretty well in general. And I won't speak so much. I don't remember what the paper on Ecuador finds, maybe what my co-authors want. The other thing that will be the other literature we contribute to, I'll talk a little about. One of the, obviously one of the really big issues with these literature in general is actually knowing where Venezuelans are. So the numbers I showed you before of 5.4 million, I mean, these mostly are not coming from official statistics. A lot of them are also estimates. So one thing we're going to do here is we're going to kind of use a modern method for trying to measure where Venezuelans are, basically Google Trends, which I'll say more about. So we're also kind of contributing to this literature. So basically we have a wide range of data sources. So like I said, there's this very specialized survey and Polve that was run in December 2018, which was focused on Venezuelans living in Peru. It's a clustered survey. It was run in kind of the 5 biggest areas, five regions where Venezuelans mostly settle in order to get a large sample. So the coverage is probably quite high. I would say probably 85 to 90% of Venezuelans it's getting. And it has really detailed data, like how did you get to Venezuela? What were the networks? What kind of jobs did you have back in Venezuela? I mean, I think it could be exploited much more deeply. Today, I'm really only going to use it to talk, maybe if I get to the discrimination, and also a little bit to tell you about, like I've done already, telling you what Venezuelans are doing. Then our main focus is going to be on the NHOW survey. This is the living standard measurement survey that's run in Peru. It's a nationally representative household survey collected monthly on a continuous basis. It goes back before 2007. We have even older data. But remember, so Venezuelans arriving in around 2016 starting, kind of middle 2016. Even with 2007, we have a lot of pre-trends. We just sort of arbitrarily decided to start in 2007. And this goes all the way until the beginning of 2020 already, but pre-COVID. The nice thing about it, it has large samples. You'll see that it has good labor market data. And it also collects some data about people's opinions, for example, about corruption and about the labor market. So it has a little bit of data beyond typical kind of labor market data, but also a little bit about other people's opinions. Did somebody? I heard a mic come on, but I don't hear any questions. Because we wanted to kind of focus also on these kind of, say, more opinion level stuff, we're also using data from the Latin American Public Opinion Project and from the Gallup World Poll. these collect very good data on, people's opinions about various things, including unfortunately, because immigration wasn't very common in Peru, they don't really ask questions in the Peruvian samples about immigration, but they ask lots of other questions about crime, government quality, about people's opinions about their community. You'll see we started looking at a wide range of questions. We've kind of narrowed the list, of which I'll kind of show you today. There's trade-offs with both of these. So that LA POP, that's biannual. So unfortunately, it means you don't have a lot of data during the crisis period. It's biannual, and it actually switched at one point. So there's actually so I only have 2017 and 2019 during the kind of the Venezuelan arrival period. So that's not super good. We have 5 surveys, so it's a little bit harder to look at trends. The Gallup World Poll is annual, which is very nice. And we have back until 2013. But unfortunately there, we only have regional identifiers. So in all the other data, everything I'll be able to do is at the municipality level. But here we can only control for stuff at the regional level. That obviously has some trade-offs for how tightly I can control for stuff. I'm going to tell you another limitation, which we'll see on the next slide. I'm actually only going to be able to measure where Venezuelans are, also at the regional level. So it's a little bit less of a problem than it could be. But for example, I can only control for regional time trends instead of municipal time trends. So that's kind of the trade-off with Gallup. I'm going to show you results from kind of all of them together. Okay, so what's the big data challenge? So for Peru, we have really nice data on outcomes. The big data challenge is that we don't know where Venezuelans are super well. In theory and how, for example, should survey Venezuelans, they're not in there. So I mean, there's a code indicating Venezuelans, but I'm getting like 25 Venezuelan in a sample when there should be 1,000 of them, basically. So I mean, they're just not getting picked up. There was a census run in 2017. Venezuelans are in the census in 2017, but you have 40,000 when you should have 400,000. So there's something about, I don't want to go, I haven't quite, there's something about the way Peruvians are collecting national statistics where Venezuelans are not getting into the sample frame, basically. There is also administrative data. We just got new administrative data, but I haven't been able to look at it. The biggest issue with the administrative data, it's the administrative data we originally had was just on points of entry. So that's pretty good at measuring people arriving. It doesn't tell you anything about people leaving. So that could include tourists, return migration, temporary migration. And you don't know where people are because you're just getting the border location. And most Venezuelans are coming through the Ecuadorian border. So like almost 80% are coming through Tumbes, which is the northern border. So you're not getting much information from that. I now have new data about the applications for the PTP. So for this temporary permit that allows you to permanently be in Peru, that they might be more accurate for location, but I haven't had a chance to look at them yet. Okay, so what do we actually do in this paper? So what we do in this paper is we use Google Trends to construct a proxy of immigrant exposure at the region year level. So we take this idea that Santa Maria is used in her paper on Colombia. It's the same idea, which is we pick keywords that we expect to be kind of fairly exclusively Googled in Peru by Venezuelan migrants, right? So that's really the key, right? You don't want to, you can't just use Venezuelans, right? Because Peruvians might be also Googling about Venezuelans. So we try to pick particular terms, and we focus on 3 terms. One of them is SAIME. SAIME is the immigration agency of Venezuela. So this is who you need to Google if you need to get a passport, if you need to kind of do anything related to Venezuelan stuff. The second one is PTP, which is the initials for this temporary permit that people need to apply for to be in Peru. And the third is the name of a newspaper, La Patilla, which was a newsletter that's kind of for Venezuelans living in Peru. I'm going to show you everything which is using kind of a combined search of the 3, an index based on a combined search of the 3. If we use them individually, we get similar results, but this has the strongest, basically the strongest kind of correlation with what I do know about where Venezuelans are in Peru. Okay, I can show you the nice thing is they look pretty good. So remember, I have two bits of information about where Venezuelans are in Peru. So for 2017, I have a census. I told you it's got a huge understatement of where people are, but there is a strong correlation. So this is the Google, you can ignore the scale here. I think it's 10,000s. So you can see there's a strong correlation where people are Googling for these particular terms that are specific to Venezuelans and where Venezuelans were living in 2017. So this is 2017 Google versus 2017 census. And you can see we got a pretty strong correlation. Probably even better, I have my NPOVI sample in December 2018. Remember, that was intentionally not done in all of Venezuela, but that has good coverage. And again, you can see a pretty strong correlation. So here's an example. So, there's places where people are Googling about Venezuelan specific terms where there's nobody in NPOVI, because NPOVI didn't survey there. So that's why you have some zeros down here. But you can see in general, okay, this is just at the regional level. There's only 25 regions. You're getting a fairly strong correlation, at least with the data that I'm able to see. Ooh, I can't see my back button. Oh, there's my back button. I got in the wrong place though. So they look pretty correlated. I mean, what are the downsizes? Okay, so obviously if there was no correlation at all, you would just expect to get kind of zeros, right? If this is picking up nothing. So I mean, if anything, you would be probably leading yourself towards finding kind of null results, which we mostly don't find. So what are the other issues with Google Trends? So I mean, one is this, Google Trends are scaled between 0 and 100. So everything is in relative terms. So what we do basically is we're going to standardize. We just standardize the index. So I'm going to talk about a standard deviation increase in migration. So I don't know what that means in level terms. My PTP numbers are going to help with that. So we haven't done it yet, but I will be able to sort of say, at least this is how many people are applying for a PTP from Venezuela at a particular point in time in Peru. And I could probably use that to help kind of say what the absolute size effects are. I think that's a small issue. The bigger issue with Google Trends is that, Google has a mysterious threshold that they don't tell you. So if searching is below some threshold, you just get zeros. And that's actually why we have to do it at the regional level. In theory, Google searches actually can do more detailed level than that, but we don't get enough searches when we go to a more detailed level than regions to get anything. We just get mostly zeros. So that's a small downside. There's going to be some places with Venezuelans where they're going to pick up with zeros. Remember, I'm also going to have an IV approach. So one advantage of my IV is that will help with some of the measurement error issues. So the IV will kind of reduce some of the measurement error concerns, which should probably mostly bias me towards finding less effects. Although actually I haven't decided. I think I need to sit down carefully with the econometrics and think about what this threshold effect does. That's not classic measurement error, right? That's places that have some people being marked as zeros. So that's a little bit of an unusual type of measurement error. Okay, I kind of answered some of these questions, but this was just, Sebastian was asking a little bit. This is just a comparison. So this is, the right column comes from this NPOVI survey. The left column comes from the NHOW, the Peruvian survey, just for the exact same period, December 2018. So I mean, the main thing to see, you can see Venezuelans are much younger, like I said. On average, in December 2018, they're in Peru for about 8 months. So they've been there not so super long. You can see they're way more educated. So 39% have a university degree versus only 13% in Peru. I mean, you can see really at the bottom. So almost 50% of Peruvians have less than a secondary education, only 17% of the Venezuelan migrants. They're more likely to be single, partially from being younger. They're living in smaller households. Most of them are working. Most Peruvians are working too. You'll see it on my next slides. This is men and women combined. Most of the non-working is women, both among Venezuelans and among Peruvians. So that's, that kind of answers a little bit Sebastian's questions. The labor market is pretty robust for Peruvians. Venezuelan men is like 98% are employed. So, I mean, you don't go all the way to Peru to sit and do nothing, right? So people are working. The only people who aren't working are probably because of household situations. You can see Venezuelans, there's about 8% employed in formal employment versus around 20% of Peruvians. Labor income is much higher for Peruvians, even though they're much less skilled. And you can see the Venezuelans are really concentrated. Like I was saying, you can see in elementary occupations, and especially, in service and sale workers, that's where they're really over concentrated above Peruvians. You can see a lot of low-skilled Peruvians are very strongly concentrated in agriculture, where probably unsurprising, Venezuelans that are making this large trek to Peru, they're not going into farming. So we don't see any basically working. It's actually more fishing than farming in Peru, but we don't see any working in the agricultural sector really. You can see very few, few professional, but very little. And a little bit more in technical and associate professionals. I haven't looked carefully at the data from Venezuela, but if I remember correctly, something about 25 to the NPOVI asked about their job before they left Venezuela, and something like 25 to 30% would be working more in like professional jobs in Venezuela before leaving. So I mean, this is a huge occupational downskilling for Venezuelans. let's see, how am I doing? I'm not going to get to the second part of my paper, I think. Okay, so what do we do? Our main estimation is a two-way fixed effects model. So we're basically going to control, we have a bunch of outcomes, which are measured at the individual level. We know people's municipality, which is a subset of a region over time. Migration, remember, we only know where Venezuelans are living on the regional level from this Google trend measure. So this proxy for regions at time, basically starting in 2016. There's no searching really before 2016. So all the data for 2016 is basically picking up controls and pre-trends, right? And then I have time and municipality fixed effects. And kind of importantly, I have this municipality time trends, right? So I'm able to really look at when Venezuelans arrive in an area, how do outcomes for Peruvians in those areas change over time? You know, what is the kind of, with the possibility that they're growing already, right? I have a bunch of individual level controls, basically age, educational, marital status, household size. For my non-employment, for my non-labor market outcomes, I can also control for labor market stuff. Standard errors are clustered at the regional level. So there's only 25 regions. So, you know, you're kind of on the border, but I think we're still okay. Okay, so what's the main threat to identification, right? So local time-specific shocks that might impact both the location of Venezuelans and outcomes for Peru, right? So we're really worried that Venezuelans at a particular time, you know, pick a particular location in Peru for what's going on there, right? So clearly, you know, that's a reasonable issue. So what do we use? We use historical Venezuelan migrant networks in Peru. So just measured in the 2007 census. Remember, I don't know, well, at least in the data I had up until now, I didn't really know kind of entries to Peru at the aggregate level. In the typical shift share instrument, right, you would interact, you know, the number of arrivals in each year with the location of where people were already. But what are we going to do instead? I'm just going to interact it with year dummy variables. So this is just a semi-parametric version of a traditional migrant network instrument. It's actually kind of recommended by some of this new literature as it's less sensitive to functional form. So you don't assume any functional form. You basically are doing this. I have my measure of where Venezuelans are in 2007, and I'm looking to see how does it correlate with where I see Venezuelans in each year, right? So 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. Ignore the last one for a second. And you can see in general, the thing you're looking for is that the kind of the first stage is pretty consistent over time, right? So the correlation, you can see it's a little stronger in 2016, but the correlation of where Venezuelans were in 2007 is more or less the same with where Venezuelans are going over time. That's going to get rid of you all the specific shock problems, right? Because people are kind of going based on where people were already settled in 2007, which obviously can't be responsive to changes over time that happened after that. You can see there's a strong correlation if I just look in the censuses between 2007 and 2017. You know, there you can also see the network effect is very strong. Okay, so what's the main identification assumptions? Right, so locations of Venezuelans in 2007 are not related to changes in outcomes for Peruvians 10 years later. You know, so that's the serial correlation kind of assumption. In my opinion, when you also have these municipal time trends, it seems pretty reasonable that you would expect this to hold. And the second one, which in a lot of cases you might be worried about, is that the supply of Venezuelans over time, it's not happening because of what's going on in Peru. I think we can pretty safely say that really most of the flow of Venezuelans is because of what's going on in Venezuela. And then they're sort of kind of randomly allocating themselves to different South American countries. That might change with COVID, for example, right? With COVID, and also there's been more policy changes now making it harder for Venezuelans to come. So you could think then, you know, in the later periods now you might get, you know, Venezuelans might stop going to Peru because COVID's very bad, right? That's going to cause you more problems with the instrumental variable approach. Over-identification test is basically a test that those slopes are all the same. We pass it very nicely. So the slopes look all the same. The F-stats are very high. So, I mean, it's like 400 or something like that. So it's never a problem with the network instrument, right? It usually always has a good first stage. It's more the problem of the exclusion restriction that we're usually worried about. Okay, so main results. Okay, just start with the first two panels. So panel B is that's not the IV. So that's just using the two, maybe I shouldn't label it OLS, but it's basically using the two-way fixed effects. So month, year, municipality fixed effects, and municipal time trends. What's our main finding? Places that get more Venezuelans, you see on average positive labor market outcomes for Peruvians. So they're not huge on overall, right? So a 1 standard deviation increase in Venezuelans has a small, remember, employment rates are pretty high already. So a 0.3 percentage point increase in employment, a 0.8 percentage point increase in wages. This is just for people employed. So there's the selection issues, and about a 2% increase in total income. I need to add in, I have data. I realized last night that I have data on work hours. So I think hours must be increasing. It's the only thing that kind of also explains why the increase in household income, while it could also be because of assorted mating, is higher than the increase on wages. We don't see as much on expenditure. C compared to B is just the IV. You can see the kind of, the general results are pretty similar. They're kind of, twice as large, right? So it's kind of 40, this is kind of about 60% larger, the impact on total income. The other coefficients are all about twice as large, which also makes some of them significant. It's actually very interesting when I show you all the other outcomes, like non-labor market outcomes, there generally the IV looks a lot like the OLS. This is the only place where we kind of see, say, slightly bigger IV effects, but kind of on a reasonable order of magnitude, maybe not in the direction necessary where I would think the selectivity might go. If you separately look at men and women, which I'll show you then in more detail in the next couple of slides, one thing that's very interesting, and that's why we're looking at it, we got interested in the labor market stuff first by finding positive effects. And also the effects seem to be a bit stronger for women. So you can see the impacts, wages, no, but the impacts on employment are stronger for women, also on formal employment, and also on household income and household expenditure. We find stronger impacts on women than men. So I kind of wanted to dive into this, and you can see what I said before. So about 90% of Peruvian men are working. So it's quite high. So I'm going to show you on the next 2 slides. It's just a breakdown of these results by the education of the Peruvians. So the right-hand side measure is still total Venezuelans. So, if you read this literature, a lot of older papers used to kind of compare people within the same skills cell, for example. But now I think people have pretty decided that the right way to model this is to think about the overall supply and how that affects outcomes for different groups of people. And then you could also think more carefully. Juan does a lot of work then thinking more carefully about, how does this come about? What is it about the production function that generates this? These results are super interesting. These are my results from just yesterday, but I think they're super interesting. So when we look at men, in men, you can see very strong heterogeneity by skill. So for example, for men, we see the employment effects are strongest for low-skilled men, who actually have the highest employment rates to start off with. But and we see also some occupational upgrading. But there we see some negative effects, which might be competition effects. So lower wages, and also a little bit smaller levels of formal employment for low-skilled men. So for low-skilled men, we're seeing some look like maybe wage competition effects, even if there's some, this is an occupational ladder just based on 1-digit occupations. So it's not really ideal, and I'll do this more carefully at some point, but this is some kind of measure of occupational upgrading. For medium-skilled men, we see a lot less, maybe a little bit of occupational upgrading. For high-skilled men, there's where I'm seeing we don't see anything on employment, but there's where the positive wage effects are, right? So for high-skilled men, there looks like potentially some complementarities with what kind of Venezuelans are doing when they enter the labor market. So with higher wages, also more likely to be in formal employment. I'm now going to show you women, and this is even more stronger, the heterogeneity. So for women, when we look at low-skilled and medium-skilled women, for their own outcomes, we see nothing. So for low-skilled and medium-skilled women, there's really no changes in outcomes. Household level outcomes, yes, right? So that's kind of interesting. I have to think a little bit more about the assortative mating side. Like I said, I just ran these yesterday, but there seems to be increasing household income and household expenditure for low-skilled and medium-skilled women. And then if you look at high-skilled women, you can see there you're seeing really strong occupational upgrading, increases in formal employment, and increases in wages. So, I think it's really, the co-authors I think it's the first time they're seeing it for sure. So, one of the main findings I would say at this point is that I think that low-skilled Venezuelans are providing services that are allowing higher skilled Peruvians, especially women, to maybe specialize more in the labor market. So very similar, to the work by Patricia Cortez and Tejada on the US, this idea that you get low-skilled immigration, you get more household services, you can buy food more easily, you can get people to clean your house, you can get cooks, and this allows more specialization in the labor market. But we need to look at this in much more detail. I can see so just quickly through other outcomes. So remember, a lot of the focus of the paper is also on other outcomes. So there we have a wide range of, I think I'll just probably focus, you can see in general, the OLS and IV are very close. So here first is the slide. This is looking at employment and corruption. So what do we see here? Perceptions of, at the national level, we don't see any changes in Peruvians' opinions about whether employment is a problem, whether corruption is a problem. Their perceptions of local corruption actually go down. So in places with more Venezuelans, so a 1 standard deviation increase in Venezuelans leads to about a 0.05 standard deviation decrease in perceptions of local corruption. So people in areas with more Venezuelans actually feel that they report they feel less corruption in the area. But even though that they're getting better economic outcomes, this is a question asking about your overall economic life. So that includes like how included you are in the labor market. People are reporting more negative opinions. So they have negative opinions about their kind of overall kind of economic life, even though I just showed you that they in general have better economic outcomes. This is now looking at crime and safety. We have administrative data on crime. Places where Venezuelans live, consistent with what's been found for Colombia, have less crime. So less reported crime, especially nonviolent crime, but we just don't see anything positive for violent crime. So this is from administrative data. So these are really like municipality level regressions, even though I do it with the individual level data. There's some evidence that people also report themselves less likely to be a crime victim. So this is a 10 percentage point decrease in the likelihood of reporting yourself as a crime victim. That one is not robust to the IV, but it's there outside of the IV. And on neighborhood safety, on average, we don't find very much. So people reporting crime as a major problem, or personal security being a problem, or neighborhood safety. But we do find some, it's marginally significant for women saying that, so this is reporting lower levels of neighborhood safety and more worries about personal security. So this is in areas with more Venezuelans, women are reporting these things. And then the last bit of kind of outcomes we look at are around kind of community attachment and community stuff. There also we find kind of consistent again with this sort of negative, somewhat negative feeling about Venezuelans. So for example, people report they're less likely to trust their neighbors. There's a bit of a negative, this isn't significant, but of quality of local services. It's not completely consistent. So we do find a positive effect on this kind of overall measure of community quality. I mean, clearly one issue with Gallup is you have a lot of different indices that kind of measure slightly abstract and overlapping stuff. So you have to kind of decide, I don't have a way of weighing these things so easily. What's the quality of local services versus the community quality? Sorry, that's from 2 different data sources. So quality of local services from LA Pop and community qualities from Gallup. So there we find, a little bit more, say, mixed evidence, but basically a kind of a negative trust in neighbors. That's the main, I don't know, Simone told me to try and finish at this point. So I might just, this is the main.
You can take 3-4 more minutes if you want, Steve.
I can't do the other part in 3-4 minutes, so I'm just going to skip it, which I think is okay. I'll give a really general. So basically, we look at how local labor market conditions affect people's likelihood of experiencing discrimination. In general, yeah.
Maybe before you go to the second part, one question. I'm trying to get my head a little bit around about your measurement of the immigration shock. So, because maybe I missed it, but you are measuring the immigration shock by the Google Trends things. And the Google Trends, if I understand that right, is a relatively measure. So it is giving you the number of migrants in a region compared to the region with the highest number of migrants, or I said migrants, but with the highest Googling of the specific words, right? So it's always relatively to a specific region, the region with the highest Googling.
Well, not the region, but the region time with the highest Google.
The region, right? So it's even changing. It could be different region and it's different region times, right?
No, but everything is relative to that. So you don't do the Google Trends separately for the region. So everything is relative for every single region time. It's relative to the region time with the highest level.
Exactly, so but that could be every year. It could be a different region, right?
No, it's all the same. It has to be. It's all to. Is that right, André? Do you want to jump in, André? André knows the Google Trends better than I do. My understanding is all relative to whenever the highest search term is during the entire period that we look at. I don't believe that it's relative to in each year. So the Google Trend is not done separately for each year. You really look at the Google Trends over time, and they're all indexed to the same thing.
Okay. Right, I'm still a bit struggling with it. How do you interpret that really? Is because it's relative. It's not really the clear migration shock. It's always relatively to the region with the highest surging, right? So how do you think about that? So I haven't thought that through.
Well, remember, everything has region fixed. Well, everything has municipality fixed effects. So basically, everything has region fixed effects. So what I'm really picking up is the increase in Googling over time in the same place. I mean, nothing here is cross-sectional, right? The whole identification.
Let me quickly jump in. So this is the raw data that Sebastian is talking about, I think. So this is always normalized between 0 and 1. Now, that's why we cited this other paper, which proposed to do a transformation on that data at the region year level, which then gives you relative shares across regions and years at the year level. Okay, so basically an immigrant concentration of 100% percentage, if you want.
No, and I was going to say, I think the most important thing is that all the identification comes from changes in Googling. Let's call it what it is. Changes in Googling within time, in one location, right? So this is basically saying that when people are Googling more for Venezuelan terms in a particular location, people report less trust in their neighbors, controlling for the time trend in trust for neighbors. That's the right way to think about it. I think the concern is maybe around definitely understanding the magnitude of the impact is difficult, but understanding the identification is clean. I mean, I think in this sense, because the shock is because everything is relative within the same location to the same index, basically. I hope that answered. That's a really important. No, I mean, thank you, Sebastian, for asking it. I'm going to skip this part just so in case people have more questions about the more interesting part. Maybe I'll just show this one table really quickly. So I mean, one thing that's very interesting. So I'll show you this. So reported discrimination is quite high. So for example, 36% of Venezuelans report having felt discrimination. We know the three main locations for this are basically at work, in streets and public places, and on a public transit. The interesting thing is that we find is that better local labor markets, as you might expect, they do reduce reported discrimination, but mostly in public places and on public transit. We don't find significant results for at work. And that kind of suggests that kind of what's going on the discrimination side kind of has more to do with how Venezuelans, not how they're being treated at work, but maybe just more in general, how welcome they feel in general. And this is kind of just, this table is the regression coefficients. So this is just like an OLS regression of who experiences discrimination. I mean, one thing to really notice, for example, especially for women. So one thing that's interesting is it's not an assimilation effect in a sense. So the longer people spend time in Peru, the more they say they've experienced discrimination. People with higher levels of education report more experiences of discrimination. And people with more with jobs is kind of a bit mixed. Jobs, it seems to relate a little bit kind of low skilled jobs, which I think may have to do with being kind of present in the public a lot, also report experiencing more discrimination. I mean, I didn't have much time to talk about the identification strategy. It's a cross-sectional model. We have somewhat of a reasonable IV, but we could spend a lot of time talking about whether it's a good approach or not. But I would rather have, I think, more time to have comments on the first part than to go more deeply into that. So what are our overall, just to kind of summarize, Venezuelan immigration leads to better labor market outcomes for Peruvians, less reported crime, and lower perceived levels of local corruption. On the most objective measures we have, things all look good. I mean, it all looks like that Venezuelans coming has been good for Peruvians, but we also find worse perceptions of the economic situation and also personal security and less trust in neighbors. So there does seem to be, I guess this is kind of my second part here, of a disconnection kind of between the objective and subjective economic situation in Peru. And I think so we have two parts of the paper that we really want to explore a lot more, AKA it might become two different papers. One is thinking about kind of the role of the media and political disinformation in kind of creating this kind of disconnection between objective and subjective outcomes. I mean, the crime one is very clear. I mean, crime rates are way down in places that have more Venezuelans or more searching for Venezuelans, but people think that they have less personal safety, right? So that's this is a very interesting disconnection, kind of consistent, I think, with Sandro Pazzo's work on Colombia. High-skilled Peruvians benefit the most from entry to the Venezuelan labor markets, Peruvian women. Okay, I kind of just said the last bit. So I think, I mean, one interesting question, I mean, is what's going on with Venezuelans themselves? You know, is discrimination really picking up kind of a disappointment and a lack of opportunities, you know, being stuck in low-wage jobs Is that kind of what's kind of driving Venezuelans basically to feel kind of unhappy with their situation, which they kind of report as discrimination? I mean, it's very difficult. You know, as labor economists, we know actually measuring discrimination is very difficult. So I'll stop, so at least I have some minutes for questions.
Those 66% of people, right?
Yeah, I mean, the variation is not, I mean, let's see where you can best see it. It's not quite, I mean, in Pompeu, it doesn't look as concentrated. So, I mean, that's the problem with some of the data sources in a sense. So this is the Pompeu sample. So the biggest circle is going to be Lima. So, I mean, that's saying of the sample, so I think Pompeu has 7,500 without going backwards, almost about 3,000. So it is true, it's close to half. So about 3,800 are in Lima out of 7,600 that are in this Pompeu sample. So it's half, but it's not non-trivial. You have, over 1,000. You have over 1,000 in other. So this would be the biggest areas besides Lima. I mean, Lima is a big metropolitan area also, but you have quite a few also in Arequipa, in Trujillo, in people who stay at the border in Tumbes. So, I mean, that's one other area, and also around Cusco. This isn't showing you the number of people. But this is showing, this is where the Pompeu sample is taken. So that's just to show you the areas. I'm trying to think. I don't think I have the table of where people are, which would be nice. No, it's a good point, Juan, and we should double check to see what the results look like without Lima. I mean, both in the sense of whether I lose significance entirely and whether there's something interesting still there. I mean, Lima has a lot of different municipalities, but of course we can't measure the migrants themselves. We don't know so detailed which municipalities they're in, or whether we should even be doing it at the municipality level for labor markets. I mean, that's a difficult choice in itself.
Yeah, I agree. And then I have a second question, which was, so, like, I mean, you're saying, you were making fun at the beginning about this documento temporal de permanencia kind of thing, right? So which means that these guys are essentially allowed in, for now, on a temporary basis. We'll see what happens in the future, right? But for now, their prospects are not for the long term. I mean, one interesting thing to check would be, I think, like human capital type of jobs. So you were saying you were showing this occupational distribution. I can think that, for example, it's normal that in occupations where there is a lot of firm-specific human capital, occupation-specific human capital, they're not going to hire these guys because, in a few years, I mean, these guys might have to leave, right? So,
or they might want to leave. I mean, I would think that might be a side of things also. I don't think Peruvians think that. I think everyone in South America thinks that if things got better in Venezuela, all the Venezuelans would leave. I mean, as somebody who knows Venezuelans, they're very attached to their country. So,
well, that's an additional thing. But even if that was not the case, even if things were not getting better,
the permanent could get taken away.
Right. I mean, they don't have a permit to stay forever, right? So then these might affect the expectations. And so you were talking about discrimination at some points of the talk, and on the other hand, maybe it's not really discrimination. It's just that it's not worth to invest in those people in certain occupations.
No, that's a very good point. I think I'm trying this another round of Pompeu survey will come out, I think, for 2020. So I don't know exactly the situation with COVID. I should ask the people I know who are involved in the survey. That will be a little bit helpful. Remember, the data we have on Venezuelans so far is only cross-sectional. So it's kind of hard to answer any of these kind of questions. But when there's another round of it, that will be very helpful, right? Because then we'd be able to see if they upskill. I mean, honestly, it's super disappointing, and I don't know the reason behind it, why they're not getting captured in the Peruvian survey data. Because this Peruvian labor market survey, I mean, it has a code for whether they're Venezuelan, but there just aren't any. So maybe that also gets better over time. Let's see. Maybe that has something to do with the listing of dwellings. Maybe they don't have the listing of dwellings of where Venezuelans are staying, because it would be super nice to be able to. I agree. I mean, it's a super interesting question to see if maybe it's extremely sensible what Venezuelans are doing. Why invest in this is perceived discrimination. They are asked, do you feel you have been discriminated against? Like I said, most of the reports, the highest reporting, are in public places and in public transit. So, I mean, that could be.
Oh, sure. I mean, but if you feel, you are entitled to that job, you're not hired, you feel discriminated, but this doesn't mean you are. I mean, this doesn't mean that firms are not maximizing their expectations. And perhaps despite the cross-section, and here I might be biased, of course, that some structure might help you in being able to analyze questions in this direction of human capital, because you do have rich data for Peruvians. It's just you don't have.
It's something we should definitely talk more about. I was gonna say the other really interesting part is we have super detailed occupational data. So I mean, the Venezuelan data is write-in data. So I mean, it's the reason why I haven't looked at it in super detail is because it's too detailed. So I mean, I have vender mejor, I know people are selling arepas on the street, or if they're selling, trinkets on the street. So there's like 1,000 categories of industries and occupations. So that's made it hard to actually look at the data, but I think there could be some very interesting questions you could ask with this type of data about what kind of jobs people are doing.
Okay, so Steve, let me call first part of the day. So thanks to you, to André, and to Gianmarco for being online. This was the last seminar. I hope that all of you will enjoy the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. We will be back in October on a bi-monthly basis. So we have decided to reduce the frequency every 2 weeks. We will alternate with the junior seminar, and hopefully, because all of us will be able to progressively resume, standard face-to-face traditional seminars.
We hope.
At a lower frequency. So enjoy the summer and the rest of the day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Simone, for everything.
Thanks to all of you.